Uh, Welcome to my workshop. I'm going to talk about the authentication and authorization plugins, which were newly introduced with CakePHP 4, because especially in the last few months, there were some major questions in that regard about how, the new plugins work and how you have to migrate stuff over. And so basically, I just want to give you a quick overview of what is happening in the new plugins. But just first of all, who am I? I'm Kevin Pfeifer. I'm a web developer at Sunline Web Innovations in Austria. My main work basically consists only of WordPress and Drupal. Lately, I've been doing some little Laravel work, but yeah, that's basically what my main work is currently about. I started using CakePHP 3 in 2017 and loved it ever since. I fortunately have gotten the opportunity to join the core team last December, so I am very grateful for having given this opportunity and being part of this very awesome team. And if you haven't already seen, there is also a YouTube video series currently being in development, where I've published 11 YouTube videos also explaining the whole CakePHP framework and going there step by step. But let's first of all get our basic setup running. In that regard, the only thing I would require you to have is a basic PHP CLI. So here I have PHP 8.1.10 and some version of Composer running, so we can basically download and get our things ready for what we are trying to do now. So the same basically as Jorge did before, we are downloading the CakePHP app template and getting everything started. So basically I also just copy paste this command. I usually don't put it inside an extra app folder, and instead I just specify that the app should be installed into the current folder where I'm currently at. So yeah, then I just don't have this extra app folder. But yeah, it's basically the same. So yeah, the other part I'm also using differently is I'm using the default BinCake server utility to basically start our web server just via default PHP server. And then if I move my window around, we get our default CakePHP app. But as we see here now, we are not connected to our database. So yeah, the other part I've also prepared on my side is just default MySQL or MariaDB database setup, where we have access to that to some sort of database. So here I just created a user and an empty database. And so first of all, we need to connect to that. So yeah, I have a fixed IP locally. So yeah, I don't need to specify anything there. And username, password, and database is also the same for me. That's basically all we need to adjust inside our app local PHP. And then if I reload, we can now see that we can connect to our database. So yeah, then of course, if I go back to my slides, we have a sort of schema we are working here today with. So I will post that link also in the Slack chat and in the Ring Central chat. Just have to find how I can reopen that window currently. or maybe someone can please just post that link into the RingCentral chat as well. So yeah, you can follow along and import that schema as well. So basically, if I now go back to my PHP myadmin and just say import that cakefest SQL, we basically just have two tables here now. We have the users and we have the products. To make it as easy as possible, I have chosen this design, which I will explain a little bit later. Yeah, I just noticed I just have some data already present in there. I will just delete that for now. So yeah, we have just the empty tables here, and we can basically now also use this bean cake bake all everything. So we also now generate all the controllers, all the entity classes, all the controllers and templates, etc., all automatically, and we don't have to specify anything. Yeah, in that regard, we should now be able to access that these tables and these now generated code parts just via /products and /users. And yeah, basically the default bin cake bake stuff we are, I would say, used to in that regard. But now we are going into the real stuff. So let's imagine we are a bar owner, and the bar owner gives the discount for 10% for our members. So whenever we have a member and someone buys something, we give them a 10% discount. Then on some day when we are open, customer goes into our shop, and the conversation would typically go, well, what can I get you? I'll take a beer, please, paying right away. Here you go, that will be €3. But then the customer says, well, but I'm a member. So in that regard, how would you react? We don't know the customer, and he just randomly says, I'm a member. In that regard, we don't know who he is, so we need a way to authenticate that he's actually a member. Typically, in such a scenario with a bar members club in that regard, you would either have a members card or a personal ID and the members list on our side, or there are definitely other ways as well. But that's basically the main idea, that for any anonymous users, which we don't know, we need to have some sort of way how we can identify them, and how, yeah, basically they identify to us who they are. So going now back to our CakePHP application, we can now install the new authentication plugin. So basically we just need to require the new plugin. Sorry for random coughs. I'm also a little bit sick, but yeah, just the time, I would say, that's having to be a little bit sick in that regard. But yeah, we now did our composer require, which basically just installed the PHP package into our application. If we now go back to our quick start guide, we now, of course, also have to load our application. You can either do that, of course, via the beancake plugin load command, as we've seen before with Jorge. But I also just like to basically manually add it here. It's basically the same. But yeah, And then we get into a little bit more, I would say, complicated stuff, because first of all, we have to use a bunch of classes inside of our application PHP, which seems a bit, yeah, okay, seems a bit weird at the start. One thing which is currently wrong in the documentation is the fact that the middleware queue is already present inside this copyable block, but the middleware queue is already present inside the automatically generated app template. So we shouldn't have a duplicate use statement in there. But anyway, let's just continue with the authentication setup. Next, we need to add the authentication service provider interface to our application class. So we now just basically say implements and this class, which also automatically, either imports the class if it hasn't already been defined, but we previously just copied it because it is already present inside our use statements here above. Then let's just continue with what is described here. Next up, we need to adjust our middlewares because we now have an additional authentication middleware which needs to be loaded to have our authentication logic being present inside our app. And the major important part here is that the authentication middleware needs to be loaded after the routing and after the body parser middleware. So that is very important if you're also following these steps or manually adjusting your middleware. So here's the routing middleware, here's the body parser middleware, and here we now have our new authentication middleware. And then we get into the, I would say, the major confusing part, which gets asked a lot in the support channel. And it's about this get authentication service method, which we just copy pasted here from the getting started documentation. And for that, I will just quickly go through what is happening here. So basically, the get authentication service method needs to be present here because we implemented this new interface. So inside this interface, we have the get authentication service. That's why we need to implement it now inside our application PHP file. And in here, we basically have to define our authentication service, which gets returned, as you can see here, by the return parameter. And the authentication service is also just a class which the plugin provides for us in that regard. And to quickly just go over the configs here, we have an unauthenticated redirect. So whenever someone tries to access the page and is not authenticated, we can define where does this user get redirected to. And we also can specify the query param for any additional redirects, which we'll go back to, but I will show you later what I mean by that. And now to the, I would say definitely the more confusing part is the authenticator part and the identifier part. And for that, I will go back to my slides. Let's go back to here. So what is an authenticator? An authenticator is basically the part or the source from which we get the information about the user who wants to identify himself. So typically these are either the form, the session, or the cookie. So basically, yeah, the part of the request which we need to parse and we need to get into some sort of unified structure. So we then can later use this data from either the form, session, or cookie to then use inside an identifier. And an identifier is then the connecting part which takes the authenticator data and maps it to a user entry inside our database. So typically, these are either username and password or API and JVD tokens. So yeah, basically, no matter if the username or password is part of a form or a session or a cookie, it doesn't matter in that regard from which part it is. It will always be mapped to the username and password identifier, and we can get our entity, our user entity, and therefore our logged in user via that identity. Or that identifier, sorry. Identity, identifier, yeah, sometimes a little bit confusing. But yeah, just again, authenticator is the source from which we get the data, and the identifier is actually the logic which maps the data to our user. And as you can also see here, each identifier can be or is at least used by each authenticator. I will go into that detail a little bit later when we are going to basically now finish our login action, because now let's just quickly go back. What are we loading here? We are loading here the session authenticator. So yeah, whenever we have a ready-made session in that regard, which has data in it, it will be used to identify a user, or of course, to have a functional login form at all, we need the the form authenticator to load the data from the form and parse it in that regard. And the other single identifier we are currently using right now is just the password identifier, as described before, which also just uses here now the email and the password fields. So in that regard, these two fields are now represented inside our users model. So if we go into a users model, we can see here now we have an email which we use to basically log in. So there is no username here currently in our current schema. We only have an email, and we have a password which will get hashed in that regard. But yeah, let's just quickly finish up the basic setup for our authentication, and then we can go into a little bit more detail where stuff is happening and how data is flowing. So next up, we'll just load the authentication component inside of our app controller, just as the documentation suggests. I will go into this part right now. And then we'll basically now need a login method inside our users controller. So we already have baked our users model, and we already have baked our users controller, but we now need a new users login action. So I will just add that at the bottom here. To get the autocomplete here in PHP Storm, you can use the IDE helper plugin from their Euromac to automatically generate these annotations for your app. But I also usually just authentication component manually just add it here, because I just don't want to load any more plugins right now that are actually needed. But with that, we have now auto-completed property methods, and therefore the methods currently present inside the authentication component are also now loaded in that regard, because yeah, I've added the dynamic property here in the app controller. But yeah, just now we have added the login method, but let's just try to load our app again. So let's go back to here. And as you may see here now in the URL, we are getting redirected to /users/login, and then a really long query parameter, which always has users login redirect users login redirect. So we seem to have some sort of login redirect loop in that regard. And the reason behind that is simply the one part I skipped over. And this is what is basically stated here. By default, the component will require an authenticated user for all actions. So the authentication plugin requires you to be logged in for all actions. So what we previously were able to do, to list all the products and all the users, view them, add them, we are now not able anymore because we need to be logged in by default, by definition of the authentication plugin. But we can, of course, say certain methods like the login method should be allowed to be accessed. And therefore, we can call the allow unauthenticated method. This needs to be inside the before filter or initialize method inside the controller. So I usually before filter, call that, and just add this part here now to this this new before filter method. And we now should be able to, in that regard, call the index method, but what we actually want to do is call the login method without being logged in. So now let's go back to here. And yeah, sure, okay, we now have a user's login which doesn't create a redirect loop anymore, but we are now missing a template. Well, this is also prepared in that regard from the quick start guide from the authentication plugin. So we can also just copy paste the templates users. So templates users login PHP, copy paste it in. And here we have our email and password. As previously mentioned, these map to our source application fields. So this is basically what needs to be identical to what is being present inside our form. And now we have a login form. Well, sure, okay. Now we have a login form, but we can't log in because we currently have no user in our database, and we have no real method of currently adding a user to our database. Well, sure. Before we can add a new user to our database, we need to set the default password hasher inside our user entity, because by default the password identifier only checks passwords which are actually hashed. So theoretically, if you want to have a login which just uses a password which isn't hashed, which is a terrible idea, it wouldn't work, because the default authentication plugin always uses the default password hasher to check if the given password matches the hashed password inside the database. So we have to now copy paste that inside our model entity user, basically at the bottom here. We are now also missing the this was the authentication password hasher we want. It's, yeah, exactly that namespace. Let's see quickly in the chat. yeah, Martin. I want the hasher. Yes. What password hashing creates two long strings referring to DB column length? Well, at least in my case, the default password hasher didn't have a problem for 255 password column length part, but maybe, of course, if you get a hash which is longer than 255 characters, then you need to adjust the length of that column. But yeah, anyways, let's just go on. What I wanted to show you in that regard is, yeah, we currently are not able to log in, but we of course have an add method inside our users controller, which helps us add a new user to our database. Well, let's just basically allow that wrong method. Allow that method to be accessed as a not logged in user. So we can now say users add, and we can now say, okay, sure, my email, very secure password. We don't need a token right now, and my local. And so we have now a user which has been saved. If we now look into our users table, we have our user present with the email and an already hashed password. And we can now try to log in that regard. Hopefully I don't have a typo. Right. Seems like it is working because I can log in, I can view users, I can edit users, I can go into my auto model, and yeah, basically everything major is working. The next thing, the beauty of clear passwords is that send them back to the user too. Sure, clear passwords are always the best way, of course. Yeah. No, but yeah, currently we are able to log in. We were able to create a user inside our table with the add method, which already automatically adds the correct hashed password. And now I just want to quickly adjust our default layouts, because currently documentation and API are the let's say default external links, but what I actually want is to have a link to our users and product. So basically just add that in here. Users action index, and then of course the same for the products. All right, now some may already know what I'm going to try to come up with here now. Basically now we are able to log in. We have adjusted our default layout, but these links at the top are only accessible when you're logged in, but not when you're logged out. So these links should only be accessible when you're actually logged in. And for that, we have a pretty fancy view helper. So we can basically load this helper inside our app view. So let's just go into here, source view, app view. Inside our initialize, load that in. I will also now manually again identity helper define that helper property inside here, so that we here now are able to basically just say if this identity is logged in, because this is now part of this view helper. We only show the menu because, yeah, we are only able to use that menu when we are logged in. Right. So next, of course, we would like to test that this menu is not being displayed whenever I'm currently reading chat. Can we use SHA-256 security instead? Yeah, you can specify your own password hashes which use a different hashing algorithm. The default password the default password hasher. I actually don't know which algorithm it uses, but it uses the default PHP password hash method, which is default present in the PHP library. But yeah, you can of course adjust any additional password hashing methods while creating your own password hasher if you so desire. But yeah, going back to where I wanted to go, we still need some way to log out currently, because, well, now we were able to log in, but we are currently not able to log out. And for that, we have a pretty neat logout method as well inside of our authentication component. So we just copy paste that as well, put that in here. So we have a logout action inside our users controller. And yeah, we are basically just calling the logout method and then redirecting back to the login. The only thing we are now, we should now also add is that this is also linked inside our menu. So we can do the same here, logout, and yeah, okay. And call users logout. And with that, we should have a nice logout method at the top. And now we are logged out again. So yeah, with that, we are now able to log in, to log out, to create users, and basically specify which controller methods and controller actions require an authenticated user and which do not require an authenticated user. So yeah, then let's jump back in that regard to our authenticators, because there is a sort of subtype present inside authenticators, because we have persistent authenticators and we have stateless authenticators. Persistent authenticators are like the session and the cookie, which are saved across multiple requests, so you don't have to log in over and over and over again. But stateless authenticators are like the token-based authentication or HTTP basic, which are not saved inside the session or the cookie. So yeah, we are basically done with our login action. But now I want to go a little bit into more detail on how the login data is being parsed and being processed by the authentication plugin. So first of all, if we go back to our login method, we have just a typical form create for that specific method. If we go into the generated HTML, we also see that it is just a default post method which posts the action to users login. So one would typically say, okay, then the login functionality and the login logic must be part of the user's login action. But as we see here, we only have authentication get result method. And this get result method basically just fetches the result from our authentication service. There is no actual logic happening here inside the controller action, because all the login functionality is happening inside the authentication middleware. So that's why it's also important where the middleware is being placed inside our middleware queue. Because if we now go back into our middleware queue here, it needs to be after the body parser middleware, because, well, the body parser middleware parses the body, so it is actually accessible. The form data is actually accessible in a cake PHP way so that we can easily work with it. So yeah, inside the authentication middleware, if we just go into it, we are fetching our service and we are then calling service authenticate. This is basically what I'm going to go into right now, because inside the authenticate method of the authentication service, we are looping through all the authenticators and are trying to authenticate the current request, which is being passed to the middleware, with that specific authenticator that we have configured. So we go back to here. We have two authenticators here. We have the session authenticator and the form authenticator. And our typical login method currently right now just uses the form authenticator, because, well, we are sending post forms in that regard to or a post form with form data to our controller and to our Cake PHP app. But yeah, this is passed down in that regard to the authenticator inside of our authentication service. And if we are now going into our I will have to go back to here. Basically, what is happening here, we are trying to authenticate the data which is being passed to the authenticator and to the identifier, and trying to find the first match which actually results in a user identity. So in that regard, if I just put a Xdebug break here, you don't have to use Xdebug if you don't want to, but I'm just very used to it, let's just say. Exactly, yeah. The current request with all the data, which is our email and our password. And now we are going into the authenticator, which is currently the session authenticator. So if we go into here, we have the session authenticator, which implements the authenticate method. And basically, tries just to load the current session and tries to load the user from the session with the current session key. But here we don't have a session currently right now. So we are going back, looping through the rest of the authenticators we have currently configured. And therefore, our next authenticator is the form authenticator. And inside the form authenticator, we are now also having our data being parsed into our, let's say, unified data structure. And then we are trying to identify a user with the data inside our identifier collection. So yeah, that's, of course, this is very, very deep and very detailed, but I just wanted to show you in very much detail how this whole stuff is happening and how this whole stuff connects from an authenticator, identifier part, and how, yeah, basically we are now returning here a user identity, which is the entry we currently have in our database, and we are returning that back to our authentication service. So we have a valid restart, and this is basically now how this is parsed from that regard, how, yeah, the data is being executed inside the middleware and not inside the controller action in that regard. The only thing additionally happening here is whenever we have an identity which has a matching authenticator and it has not a stateless part in that regard. So if we're going back, we also have the session authenticator, which is not stateless. And therefore, whenever we are identifying ourselves with the user, we are also creating a new session in that regard for our user, so we don't have to re-log in again. But yeah, what happens if we delete the session cookie? Well, let's just quickly go through that. So currently, we are logged in. We have our application PHP session ID. And so if we delete that session cookie, of course, we are logged out because the new request doesn't have username and password login data present. And we are not sending any session or cookie data anymore, which tells the server, okay, this is an identified user. So I would say this is pretty logical. But this is also doable in that regard if we comment out the session authenticator in our application PHP. So if we go back and log in, we have again now our session. And yeah, basically you can just normally use the app. But now, if instead of removing the session cookie, I will now disable the session authenticator and reload the page, I will also get logged out, even though I have the session cookie still present, because we are not checking if a PHP session is present, and if so, trying to load the user from it. So yeah, now I can't log in anymore, exactly. Yeah, this also means in that regard that the session authenticator is a persistent authenticator, and the form authenticator is, let's say, it is stateless in that regard, because I can show you quickly. I'll just comment out the session authenticator again. We are not logged in anymore. I just delete the session cookie. But now, if we try to log in again, we basically get redirected back to the login page. And as you see here, we get a redirect param, which is also what I wanted to go back previously. This is this query parameter, which basically saves where we want to go whenever we log in. But currently we are not able to log in because, first of all, we disable the Session Authenticator. And second of all, whenever our authentication process is valid, we are redirecting to the login redirect, which is our redirect param at the top, or default to some sort of homepage or users page or something. But if we don't do that, if we are not redirecting, and just try to now log in again, we see we are logged in that regard from a CakePHP perspective, because that initial request gets parsed, has a valid user, and has therefore valid data present. The red message here is just because this flash error is present here right now. But we are not redirecting. So sure, this works for the initial post request from our login form. But of course, if we now try to go back to users or products, it doesn't work anymore because we don't have a session or a cookie in that regard. But yeah, I just wanted to show you in that perspective that the login works for the first time, but not anymore if you don't have a session or a cookie present, which saves your login credentials in that regard. Yeah. Now, the next thing I want to quickly add is Remember Me functionality. The Remember Me functionality is, I would say, pretty useful and typical for login forms to have, basically an extra cookie which saves your login data for a longer period of time than the default session, which sometimes isn't even adjustable for a specific period of time which you want your session to be alive. So you can therefore just copy paste this authentication cookie authenticator here now into our authenticator parts. Now, in that regard, as we've seen before, it is sort of important in which part or in which order you are loading your authenticators, because in that regard, here we are first checking the session, then we are trying to check the cookies, and then we are trying to check the form for any parsed data in that regard. Just saw a question. What authenticators or identifiers are authenticators for the auth component? Okay, let's just quickly go to the auth component. The auth component is a deprecated old CakePHP utility, which basically just has authentication and authorization in one part together. So whenever you have the old auth component present inside your code, this is basically just a discontinued part of CakePHP where we have a dedicated migration part of the documentation. Because also as Martin just said, the old auth component will be removed in CakePHP 5.0. And so basically I would just recommend you look into this migration from the auth component section of the documentation. But I won't go into any further detail in the auth component. But let's go back to the cookie. We specified here now that we have and separate authenticator for the cookies. We use the fields in that regard. Sorry. Just have to look something up quickly. Yeah, all that we really need in that regard is just the fields. We don't need the login URL anymore, just specifying what fields we are using. And then the next part, which is also part of this Remember Me documentation, the default field name for our Remember Me checkbox is remember_me. So therefore we can just go into our templates, users login, and output an extra this form control with remember me, and I always just like to specify the type as checkbox, and as well just to have auto completion, I like to add the dynamic property at the top for app view $this, and therefore we are now able to get auto completion inside PHP Storm for all the methods. But yeah, if we now go back, we have now a remember me checkbox. We have adjusted our application get authentication service method to have the possibility to use a cookie authenticator. And so therefore, if we now check this checkbox and load info, can't type anymore. And we now look into our application cookies. We now see we not only have a session ID, but we also have a cookie auth separate cookie, which is responsible for, yeah, basically doing that stuff. One thing I want to quickly mention in that regard, as you can see here, this PHP session is basically the identifier for your specific session, which is currently running. So if we now do a PHP session read with that ID, we basically get the same data as currently present inside the cookie auth. So if I do online UL decode, and yeah, thank you. I decode that basically what is present inside the session is the same as currently present inside our cookie. It's just that the session values live inside the server, and this cookie auth now, of course, lives on the client. If you like that or not is basically up to you. But just so you know the two differences from the cookie auth, and yeah, it's always the hashed password. The hashed password, either if it's living in the database or inside the session or inside the cookie, it's always the hashed password. We are never ever saving any plain text passwords. That's just such a big no-go. It's, yeah. It is the same hash as in the database, yes, because it uses the same default hasher to check if that specific username, password send your cookie off to friends, yeah. But yeah, it's basically the same. But yeah, the fact if you use a hashed password is, I would say, better than other plain text passwords saving stuff. But yeah, that's basically what I wanted to show you regarding session and cookie authentication. One thing I also wanted to show, yeah, because now we're then going further. If you want to access the current logged in user from, let's say, a controller inside, let's just use the index method here. We, of course, have our authentication component and have our identity. So if we look at that and PR that and go into our users index, we now see, okay, this is an identity object, and inside that identity object, we have our user with all basically the typical identity or entity data for that specific user. So you can sort of do logic based upon specific users in that regard. But also sometimes you want to access the current identity from other parts as well. Sure, currently we could easily be able to pass down the identity to the template. So this is of course one method, but the other method is also to directly use the request object. So yeah, just stay in here. We can, in that regards, say this request gets attribute identity. This is the identity, and PR that. So this would be basically the same, just with a little bit more directly accessing it. We can also get the used authenticator. Authenticator, I guess, was it, or is it differently called? No, it was called differently. Let's just go into Authentication Middleware. Basically, authentication. Okay, sorry. Yeah, we can get the authentication service directly through the request as well, if you so desire or if you so needs to. Where basically all the authentication specific data is present in here, and the last the last part is also the authentication restart. Yeah, if you want to access that directly, this is also present inside the request, where you can see, okay, the status is successful, and we also have again our associated identity. But yeah, basically these are the three main parts which you can access directly through the request. But also, if you, just like I did right now, don't know how the keys are named for the attributes inside the request, you can just go into the authentication middleware, and there you can see that we have authentication restart, and yeah, this is typically identity, but it is configurable, so it could be that you have some other key for the identity. But yeah, that's also something I just wanted to quickly show to you. So now let's look back again what we have achieved right now. We, as said before, are a bar owner. We give the 10% discounts for our members. And we are now able to authenticate and identify anonymous users via currently only passwords and usernames, or in that regard, emails. We know now the difference between authenticators and identifiers, because authenticators are the source from which data is coming from, and identifiers are the actual linking part to user entities inside our database. the concept of persistent and stateless authenticators, because persistent authenticators save a session or a cookie, so we don't have to relog in again. But stateless authenticators, like an API token, needs to be present on each request which hits our application. We know how to login data. We know how the login data is being processed by the plugin. So if you need to somehow dig into that, you know that you have to look into the authentication middleware and not inside the component or somewhere else. But now, before we continue with the authorization part, I just wanted to ask you now if there are any major questions you have right now just for the authentication part. Let's see if there's something in Slack. If user belongs to role, then is it okay? This chat is yeah. I know what you mean. So basically, when we have associated data to our user. So in that regard, if we not only have a users table, but also a groups table or a permissions table or something like that, which is associated to the users, then you, of course, want to preload this data as well whenever the identity is being loaded. And this is definitely possible. You have to go into your identifier. So here we have our password identifier. And inside the resolver, you can specify a specific finder. So whenever someone wants to log in via username and password, we can say, okay, load that user from the database via the active finder finder method inside the users table. So if I just quickly add that here, public function find active query, and I just say query contain or find groups or find permissions in that regard. So yeah, I'm just skipping around in that regard a little bit. So here we would say resolver finder permissions. And so therefore, whenever someone tries to log in via authentication password, it also just not loads the user, but also the connected permissions if the permissions association is present inside our table. But yeah, with that, you should be able to load any associated data from your users model without any problem. I'll try to reopen that chat because it's just a little bit broken for me. How to split authentication from multiple when we have a custom users. Find out maybe since this is specific. Yeah, query where active true. Yes, this is also a typical use case where we have an extra column inside our users table where we can specify if a user is actually active or not active anymore, so that any user which is not active anymore can't log in anymore. This is also something which you can easily do with a custom finder which you define inside your password identifier. But yeah, in that regard, I will just now then continue with a little bit more regarding authorization. Because if we now look back again to our bar owner example, we have a discount for 10% for all of our members. But what if we have very fancy customers and we give them 20% discounts because they are VIPs? Well, now it is not enough to know if someone is just a member or not, but we now need groups inside our members list to specify if he is now a VIP or not. And that is where the authorization part is now needed, because yeah, we have to therefore group our users into specific roles in that regard. So let's now go into the authorization quick start. We of course need the package as the first part. So composer require, no, I don't need xdebug anymore, thank you. All right, so the authorization component, the authorization PHP module is now installed. We of course have to add it again to our loaded plugins here. And then we have to do basically nearly the same as we did for the authentication part, because we now have more additional use cases which we can add, which also has a duplicate use statement in there. We have to implement a new interface, which also requires a new method, but this will come a little bit later. We have another additional middleware, which now needs to be present after the authentication middleware, because I will talk about this a little bit later again. But if you just think about it, you can't authorize someone if you don't know beforehand who he is. So we can't authorize someone if he's a VIP before we know that he's actually a member. So the member part needs always to be the first part to be checked before we can go on and do the VIP check in that regard. So first authentication, then authorization middleware. This is very important in that regard. And then we have our additional get authorization service method, which gets added via our new authorization service provider interface. What are you? Okay, yeah. I don't care about code style currently right now. Yeah. Then the next part also is we have a separate component. So inside of our controller, app controller, we have another component, which I also add the dynamic property authorization component authorization. Right. And then we can, well, sort of start doing what is explained here. So we can go, for example, inside our users edit method and can call this authorization authorize our user entity with, yeah, let's just do no second parameter, and let's just see what's happening here right now. So let's go here. Right. just like the authentication middleware happened to block all unauthenticated actions, we now have the same situation for authorization middleware, where it blocks all actions which do not have anything which requires a policy check. So yeah, we need to have either a connected policy or we need to call skip authorization on that specific method. So in that regard, currently the users index method doesn't have this authorization, skip authorization call. But with that now, basically just as before, every logged in user can use it. But if we try to go back to the, okay, yeah, the login method is also the same. We have to specify that the logout and login methods need to be able to be executed by every user. Otherwise, this doesn't work anymore. But yeah, the login method and logout, etc., are now working again, and the user's action in that regard is now working again as well. But if we now go back to our edit users method, we now see the following error. Policy for app model entity user has not been defined. All right, what does this mean? Well, as said here before, we either have to skip the whole authorization logic, or we need to connect a specific controller action or resource to a policy which specifies, does the current user or is the current user allowed to do the specific action? And for that, we need to create some policies. Policies are basically very simple, dumb PHP classes, which don't have very much logic in them. And currently, I'm just going to explain the entity policy. So we can basically generate that for our users controller. And with that, we now have a policy, users policy. Inside the users policy, we have some wrong namespaces because this is user and not users. This is also maybe something we need to adjust inside our bake template. But as you see here, we have methods for each of the controller actions which actually handle something with an entity. So can add has something to do with an entity because we want to add an entity. Can edit the same, can delete the same, can view the same. But we don't have a can index in that regard. This is the only method which is currently not present inside our users policy, but I will go into detail about that a little bit later. But to go back into what is happening here, this authorization authorize user method call here now maps to the users policy because we are in the users controller, and it now tries to call the can edit method because we didn't specify a second parameter, and the default second parameter is what the method is actually named in that regard. So we can basically just say, okay, everyone is allowed to edit a user. And with that, policy app model entity user has not been defined. What is wrong? User policy, not users policy. Again, this is something we need to adjust for our bake template because it seems that we are using the wrong name in that regard for the class, but yeah, this needs to be singular because this is an entity policy and entities are always singular named. But yeah, now we are able to edit the user again because we now have a connected user policy for the can edit authorization part. And this basically just copy pastes to all the other methods, so we can prevent or allow certain actions. So here I will now prevent here I will now prevent that users can be deleted in that regard. So inside our delete, we also need the same here as well. And with that, we can now go back to the users. And if I now want to delete the user, it says identity is not authorized to perform delete on app model entity user. All right. Sure, this is a pretty extensive forbidden exception, but maybe you sometimes just don't want to show the big exception part, but just want to show a little flash error in that regard. So what I like to do here, whenever I have this authorization authorize part, I just basically engulf it inside a try catch as a forbidden exception and basically catch that exception. And if I catch it, I just basically say flash error, nope. And now, sure, okay, now I deleted my user. But yeah, this also, of course, needs to be present inside the try catch. Otherwise, yeah, you accidentally delete a user. Let me just quickly add my user back. Right. So yeah, now we are able to prevent users from being deleted accidentally. And yeah, this is again an entity policy because all these methods here are associated to a specific user entity. But as you have previously already seen, we sometimes also maybe want to adjust the index page here to filter certain results for our current index page, because certain users are not allowed to see or edit or basically do stuff with information from other users. And for that, we have the other type of policy, and this is called the table policy. The table policy basically does what I have explained previously. Okay, I specified the entity wrong here. That's why it had the plural name. You have to call entity user, not entity users. It was my bad. But yeah, now we have a user table policy, and as you see here, we have a basically empty users table policy. And the reason behind that is that we have to specify the scopes we want to use in that regard. So scopes are something we can apply to queries. And as you see here, we have a scope index method where we can say, okay, users, let's just say email like just so that we see that it is working. And we have to apply that index scope to our index query. So we have this users finds just to get the query object. And then we can say query equals this authorization apply scope to the query. So apply scope takes a resource, and then theoretically or technically you can also specify a second parameter. But here now, let's just paginate only those which have Pfeifer KW inside the policy for app model table users has not been defined. App model table users table. Again, naming. Naming is a little bit weird here. Definitely something, yeah. But if we look into, or if we just say users add, and we just say info ads der Euromark with some password. We don't see it anymore. So we now see that the scope definitely works. But if we don't apply anywhere, we can see that we have we have all the entities present inside what is currently present inside our database. But yeah, these are basically what I just want to show you here, the main two differences between entity policies and table policies, because one is handling actions which are applied to entities, and one is handling actions which are applied to queries on that specific table. And besides that, I can also just quickly show you the second parameter thingy. So if we have here scope other, and we just say der Euromark, and we can also apply another scope to the same query, just specifying the second part of the method parameter. And therefore this other method is now being called. And with that, we don't see any entries anymore, because this is an and where in that regard. But yeah, if I just disable that now, we can see again that this is working. But just so you know how you can apply multiple scopes and how you can apply different scope actions on the same query, because this may be needed depending on how you build your authorization. This also as well applies to the normal authorized method, because we can here also say we only want to add to allow an addition of a user if the view is also allowed. So if we add the delete here, we shouldn't be allowed to access the add method anymore, because the delete policy is being applied here as well on top of the default add policy. Yeah, so these are, I would say, the two main policy parts regarding entities and tables. But of course, not all pages inside the CakePHP app are related to entities. So example given, the pages controller, the display method, just displays a static page. And sometimes you may just have a static page which shouldn't be allowed to be accessed by specific users. So in that regard, there is also the request authorization middleware. So yeah, sure, another middleware. It's just, yeah, that's how all the logic is being done for all the new authorization and authentication plugins. So if we just go now into that, we can see here another part where we have to adjust our use statements. Copy paste that in here. And we already have a bunch of duplicate here, but yeah, that's just how things are going. And the authorization service now has an additional part where we can map a server request to a request policy. So as you can see here, we have an extra class which has an extra interface called the request policy interface. And so we can specify which user, so therefore which identity, can access the current page depending on the current request. So if I just copy paste that to our policy request policy.php, copy paste that in here, and we say, sure, currently it's just, or let's just use the pages home, or in that regard, I've already prepared a little bit here. It's the same for that. So we get the current controller from the request, we get the current action from the request, and we get the current path from the request. And so therefore we are now here specifying that pages display home is not being allowed because it is the default CakePHP debug page, which has its own check as well, of course, when debug mode is disabled. But here we are checking it via the request policy. But we also now need to specify that we are using the request policy, the new middleware. So basically we can now, instead of using the ORM resolver, we can now use the map resolver, and we are mapping the server request to our newly defined request policy. Now this, of course, breaks other stuff now because we are not using our ORM resolver anymore. But let's just go back to here. Pages home did not apply any authorization checks. Because I didn't add the middleware. I was just thinking something is missing. Yeah, I didn't add the request authorization middleware. So this also needs to be present after the authorization middleware. So just put it here. So in the end, we have authentication, authorization, and request authorization middleware. And now the page's home page now gives us a forbidden exception because we are checking it with our request policy. But our users page now gives us the problem that there is no policy now defined or associated with that query or that entity, because we are now not using the ORM resolver anymore, which we previously used. And so, yes, we can mix them two together. And this is basically what is happening inside the map resolver. The map resolver, or more exactly the resolver collection, allows us to specify multiple resolvers to be used whenever a request authorization or a ORM whenever something needs to be resolved for a policy in that regard. So we can uncomment that again. We create our map resolver and basically do it like this. Yes, that's the next part. So we have our default ORM resolver. We have a map resolver, which maps the server request to our request policy. So whenever a server request is being authorized, we check via the request policy if it is actually applicable or not. And then we say, okay, our final resolver collection uses the map resolver and as a fallback, the ORM resolver, if no policies have been found in that regard or not. And therefore, we are now able, again, to use any other methods. Anything that has been blocked before is still blocked, but our page's home is now also blocked by the request authorization middleware, because we map it to our request policy. So now we are also able to block static pages for our pages controller. And then the last part in that regard, which may be also applicable to some who have bigger CakePHP applications, is whenever you whenever you have service classes. So you maybe have some sort of service or some bigger logic which has to be refactored or is part of a separate class. And so I'm here now just faking that in that regard via my service default class. Specify my super secret in here as a private integer and basically just set a random integer for that class. Then I will add that to the dependency injection, because if you're not using dependency injection till now, I can definitely recommend you looking into it, especially if you want to test stuff. It's just awesome. You don't have to think about any object creation or object dependencies, which object needs what. It's just, yeah. Anyway, and so we have added a basic my service class. We have added it to the services to the dependency injection container, but now we are also able to add it to, let's use the add injection, so my service, and here we also are able to say this authorization, authorize my service with let's call it the the access method. Now, okay, how does the connection from the service class to a policy happen? Well, this is what I've partially spoiled already while copy pasting it. Inside the map resolver, we can also map a service class with a generic policy class. So now we are also able to create my service policy PHP, copy paste it in. Okay, I called it here can access. Okay. So now we can, okay, I also called it here can access. So basically, because the map resolver maps the service resource to the my service policy inside the user's controller, where we inject our service into our add method, we can authorize the current logged in user if he's actually able to access that service or not via the can access method. And so, yeah, currently we are allowing that to be happened. But if we're now blocking that again, and we are resource class does not exist. This needs to be here. App services, my service. What am I missing? Folder is, yes, folder, thank you. Folder was named service, not services. Yes, pages users. So now inside the users add, we say, okay, identity is not authorized to perform access on app services, my service. So now we are also able to specifically create policies for services. So they are, in that regard, very detailed and applicable if you so need to. So therefore, we are able to apply authorization to entities and table queries via the ORM resolver. We are able to apply authorization to the requests and therefore the static pages via the server request and request policy. And we are also able to apply authorization to any custom services or custom classes or whatever in that regard via another mapped service policy or however you want to call it. And with that, I would say I'm pretty much done. So basically what I want to hear now from you is, are there any open questions or is there something missing which I have not explained in more detail? Or should I go over something once more which I maybe have gone over too quickly? Let's just see what chat is going to say. Any difference in using these middleware when applied to API development? Well, I can't say too much about API development because I haven't done any API focused projects till now. But what I can say is that no matter if it is an API focused project or not, these middlewares can definitely be applied for normal templated PHP or Cake PHP applications, as well as API focused applications. What I don't know is how they fit together with already present API plugins like the CRUD JSON API or some other plugins. This is just as you've seen here now, the basic application structure, how all the policies and all the authentication is handled in a default CakePHP app, but you surely am able to use it as well in an API context, I would say. Is there any built-in feature to allow permissions per field on an entity as opposed to permissions on the whole entity? So you want to specify if a given user is able to update a given field on a given entity. I would say you can basically do that with what is present here, because inside, when we look into a user's policy and we have our can edit, the can edit we currently used just before the user has been has given patched data. So basically here now we have this authorize, which calls the can edit. So the basic, okay, can a user actually edit a user or not? But you can also again call this authorize again with submit in that regard. And then we can say, okay, can submit. And depending on the user, you can now see, okay, we have the, how's it called? Users. We have the get dirty array. Yeah, this is the dirty array of the fields which have been adjusted from the form. So via this dirty fields array, you know which fields have been adjusted by the user, and depending on the fields and the current user, you can then say yes or no to the authorization, if he's actually allowed to adjust these fields or not. So map resolver would be okay to authorize prefix path. So you mean you only want to authorize specific prefixes? Nicholas, in that regard, will ask the question. Well, what you can do is you're able to load middlewares just for specific routes or specific prefixes. So instead of generally loading the authorization middleware inside the middleware method inside the application PHP, you can only load the authorization middleware whenever you are applying or having a route which is inside the prefixed route, or a resource which is inside the prefixed route, would be my quick guess in that regard. I migrated from the off component with no issues, and I strongly advise it. My only issue was reusing my custom off component authenticators. Okay, sure. Whenever you have something custom built for deprecated or outdated software part, then sure, there is definitely time to be invested. So you adjust it to the new or the currently recommended authentication workflow in that regard. But it's good to hear that, Angel, that you said that you had no problems migrating from the auth component. Yeah, exactly. You can also say user is dirty and then the specific field and return false if a specific field is dirty or not. But yeah, in that regard, I can only say thank you very much, and I do not regret getting into CakePHP. Hope you have a wonderful day or wonderful evening or morning or wherever you are. And I wish you have more luck in that regard, or have more fun with Mark Story's next talk.